If that first truck moves another 10 feet, your bridge is gone. The words cut through the morning air like a crack across glass. Conversation stopped. Boots froze on gravel. Heads turned toward the old man, standing alone behind the safety barrier. Fort Ridge Army Base had been awake since dawn. The desert sun was already climbing over the distant hills, casting long shadows across the canyon where a temporary military bridge stretched from one rocky edge to the other. 40 vehicles waited in formation. Engines rumbled. Radios crackled. Soldiers moved with practiced precision as officers prepared for what was supposed to be a routine convoy exercise. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked safe. And that was exactly what bothered Samuel Carter. At 82 years old, Samuel looked like the last person anyone would listen to. His white hair moved gently in the dry wind. His faded field jacket hung loosely from his thin frame. A worn wooden cane rested in one hand. He looked more like a retired grandfather visiting an open house than someone interrupting a military operation. Yet his pale blue eyes never left the bridge. They were fixed on a single point near the center support structure, a place nobody else seemed interested in. "Sir, you need to step back," a security specialist said politely. Samuel didn't move. "Stop the convoy." The soldier hesitated. Nearby, several young officers exchanged amused looks. Lieutenant Ryan Brooks walked over, carrying a tablet tucked beneath one arm. 27 years old. West Point graduate. Top marks in engineering assessments. He had spent months helping coordinate the exercise. "Excuse me?" Ryan asked. Samuel pointed toward the bridge. The footing shifted. Ryan blinked. Then he laughed. Not loudly, just enough to make the officers beside him smile. The footing shifted. 3 inches. Maybe less. Samuel's voice remained calm. "Doesn't matter. It's enough." Ryan glanced toward the bridge. Massive steel trusses gleamed beneath the sunlight. Sensors monitored load distribution. Survey drones had flown over it twice that morning. Every report had come back clean. "Sir," Ryan said, trying not to sound irritated, "that bridge was inspected less than an hour ago." Samuel nodded. Then they missed it. A few officers chuckled. One shook his head. Another whispered something that drew more laughter. The convoy commander continued reviewing launch procedures as though the conversation didn't matter. Around them, the steady hum of military activity continued. Engines idled. Dust drifted across the canyon floor. Flags snapped in the wind. But Samuel's expression never changed. He stared at the bridge the same way a sailor watches a storm forming on the horizon. Not guessing. Knowing. "Look," Ryan said, gesturing toward the tablet. "We've got structural analysis software, drone imaging, stress calculations, and real-time monitoring. Everything says the bridge is good." Samuel finally looked at him. The old man's eyes were clear, calm, unshaken. Bridges don't care what software says. For a brief moment, Ryan felt something uncomfortable settle in his stomach. Then it vanished beneath confidence. Around him stood engineers, officers, and specialists. Modern systems, modern data, modern answers. The old man had none of those things. Just a cane, a weathered jacket, and a warning nobody wanted to hear. The launch horn sounded across the canyon. The first convoy vehicle prepared to move. Samuel Carter never took his eyes off the bridge. The launch horn echoed across the canyon, and the sound seemed to settle into Samuel Carter's chest like a weight he had carried before. Around him, soldiers moved with confidence. Officers checked clipboards. Vehicle commanders received final instructions through their headsets. Everything followed procedure. Everything followed the plan. Samuel had seen plans fail before. The first transport truck eased forward, its diesel engine rumbling against the canyon walls. Dust drifted from beneath its tires as it rolled toward the bridge entrance. Nearby, Lieutenant Ryan Brooks folded his arms and watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed the situation had already been settled. To him, the old veteran standing behind the barrier was simply another retired observer who could not accept that the world had changed. Technology had answers now. Computers had answers. Data had answers. Experience was useful, but only when it agreed with the numbers. Samuel looked at the bridge again. The steel framework shimmered beneath the morning sun. Most people saw strength. Most people saw engineering. Samuel saw something else. He saw tension. He saw strain. He saw a structure speaking a language few people remembered how to hear. A gust of desert wind swept through the canyon. The bridge released a faint metallic groan. Almost nobody noticed. But Samuel did. His eyes narrowed slightly. The sound was brief. Barely there. Like a whisper. Lieutenant Ryan shook his head and glanced toward the officers standing nearby. "You see this?" he said with a grin. "The bridge is carrying thousands of pounds of military equipment, and somehow the only person worried is an 82-year-old man with a cane." Several officers laughed. One of them looked toward Samuel. "Maybe he thinks bridges worked differently back in the 1960s. More laughter followed. Samuel ignored all of it. He had spent too many years around young men convinced they understood everything. The sound of confidence never changed. Across the launch area, Second Lieutenant Jacob Reed remained silent. Unlike the others, he kept watching Samuel instead of the bridge. There was something unsettling about the old man's certainty. No hesitation. No guessing. No dramatic warnings. Just absolute conviction. Jacob had learned to recognize confidence. He saw it every day in officers. But this felt different. Samuel was not trying to convince anyone. He was simply stating what he believed was going to happen. And that bothered Jacob more than he wanted to admit. The first truck reached the bridge entrance. Its weight settled onto the steel structure. The bridge held. Ryan smiled. "See," he said. "Perfectly fine." Several officers nodded. One of them checked a monitoring screen and gave a thumbs up. Green indicators filled the display. Load distribution normal. Structural integrity normal. Every system reported exactly what they expected. Samuel slowly shifted his gaze from the truck to a connection point near the center span. The same spot he had been watching all morning. His jaw tightened. The wind returned. This time carrying another faint sound from deep within the structure. A tiny metallic complaint hidden beneath engine noise and radio chatter. Jacob heard it too. His eyes moved toward the center of the bridge. "Did you hear that?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered. Nobody else seemed concerned. The truck continued forward. The bridge continued to hold. And for the first time since arriving that morning, a cold feeling began creeping into Jacob Reed's stomach. Jacob Reed could not shake the feeling. The first truck was now nearly halfway across the span, moving at a controlled pace while sunlight flashed across its windshield. Around him, nobody seemed concerned anymore. The bridge had carried the load. The old man's warning appeared to be fading into an embarrassing misunderstanding. Ryan Brooks certainly thought so. He glanced toward Samuel Carter with a look of quiet triumph. "Looks like your disaster decided not to show up today," he called out. Several officers laughed again. Samuel did not answer. He stood motionless behind the barrier, his cane planted firmly in the gravel. The wind tugged at the edges of his faded field jacket. His eyes remained fixed on the same location near the center support. Jacob followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing unusual. Steel beams, support plates, bolts, shadows. Then another sound drifted through the canyon. Soft, brief, easy to miss. A metallic click. Jacob frowned. "Did you hear that?" he asked the officer beside him. "Hear what?" "That noise." The officer shrugged. "Trucks make noise." Maybe he was right. Yet Jacob's attention stayed locked on the structure. Something felt wrong. Not visibly wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Just wrong in the quiet way that precedes a problem nobody expects. Across the bridge, technicians monitored data feeds from portable stations. Green indicators filled their screens. Load levels remained within acceptable ranges. Structural stress readings appeared normal. Every number supported Ryan's confidence. Every number contradicted Samuel Carter. The first truck continued forward. The second truck received clearance to approach the bridge entrance. Dust swirled beneath its tires. Ryan nodded approvingly. Exactly what the models predicted. Samuel finally spoke. His voice was barely above the wind. "The models are measuring the bridge." Ryan smirked. "That is generally how engineering works." Samuel looked at him. "The problem is underneath it." The words lingered in the air. Jacob felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Before he could say anything, a senior engineer walked over carrying a tablet. "Lieutenant Brooks, all systems are green." Ryan accepted the report with obvious satisfaction. "Thank you." He glanced back toward Samuel. "There it is. Official confirmation." The engineer followed Ryan's gaze toward the old veteran. "Who is that?" "Apparently the only person on base who thinks our bridge is falling apart." More laughter followed. Samuel turned away from them. He looked down into the canyon below. The dry creek bed stretched between weathered rocks and patches of desert brush. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he quietly shook his head. Jacob noticed. It was not the reaction of someone hoping to be right. It was the reaction of someone who had seen this before. Somewhere. Sometime. Long ago. And for reasons Jacob could not explain, that realization frightened him far more than any warning ever could. The second truck rolled forward. Its headlights flashed briefly as it reached the bridge entrance and settled onto the steel span behind the first vehicle. The structure held. The indicators remained green. The technicians remained calm. And yet the uneasy feeling inside Jacob Reed continued to grow. He found himself watching Samuel Carter more than the bridge itself. The old veteran had not moved. He had not argued. He had not tried to convince anyone. That was what bothered Jacob most. People who guessed were usually loud. People who wanted attention kept talking. Samuel had done neither. He had delivered a warning and then simply waited. The desert wind swept through the canyon once again, carrying the scent of dust and sun-baked stone. Somewhere beneath the engine noise came another faint sound. A tiny metallic pop. Jacob heard it clearly this time. His head snapped toward the center span. There it is again, he muttered. Ryan Brooks overheard him and shook his head. You are letting that old man get inside your head. Maybe. There is no maybe. Every sensor says the bridge is fine. Ryan tapped the tablet in his hand. This equipment cost more than some houses. We are not relying on guesses. Jacob looked toward Samuel. The old man was staring at a support connection beneath the bridge deck. His expression had changed slightly. Not fear. Not panic. Something worse. Recognition. As if he had seen the next few minutes before. A senior engineer approached Ryan carrying another report. Load distribution remains normal. Ryan smiled. Thank you. He made sure Samuel could hear him. Looks like the bridge disagrees with you. Samuel finally turned. His pale eyes met Ryan's. Bridges do not disagree. Ryan's smile faded slightly. Then what exactly are they doing? Samuel looked back toward the structure. They are telling you the truth. You just do not know how to listen anymore. The words landed harder than Ryan expected. Around them, a few officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The first truck was now approaching the far side of the canyon. The second truck had reached the middle section. Everything still appeared normal. Yet Jacob noticed something. A small vibration running through a support beam beneath the deck. Barely visible. Barely noticeable. He squinted. The movement disappeared. Then returned. A tiny tremor. Like a pulse. Jacob stepped closer to the barrier. Sir, he called toward the engineering team. Can someone check the center support manually? One of the technicians looked confused. Why? Jacob hesitated. He did not have an answer that sounded professional. Only a feeling. Only an instinct. Before he could respond, Samuel quietly spoke. Too late. The words were soft. Almost lost in the wind. But Jacob heard them. Every hair on the back of his neck stood up. Across the canyon, sunlight glinted off steel. Engines continued to rumble. Radios continued to chatter. The operation continued exactly as planned. And for the first time that morning, Jacob Reed found himself hoping with all his heart that Samuel Carter was wrong. Samuel Carter lowered his eyes for a moment, and the sound of the wind moving through the canyon became something else entirely. The dry desert air vanished. In its place came heavy humidity, the scent of wet earth, and the distant rush of river water. Suddenly, he was 21 years old again. The year was 1967. Rain drummed against a temporary bridge stretching across a swollen river somewhere deep in Southeast Asia. Young soldiers moved supplies across the narrow structure, while engineers worked through the night beneath floodlights. Samuel remembered every detail. The smell of diesel fuel. The mud caked onto his boots. The constant vibration of heavy equipment. Most of all, he remembered a sound. A tiny metallic click. Almost invisible to everyone else. Almost meaningless. Almost. He had heard it while inspecting a support connection beneath the bridge. One bolt had shifted slightly under pressure. Barely noticeable. Barely measurable. But Samuel had learned something during his first months as a combat engineer. Structures always spoke before they failed. The problem was that most people only listened after it was too late. Back then he had tried to warn his commanding officer. The lieutenant had been young. Smart. Confident. Just like Ryan Brooks. The lieutenant trusted reports. Trusted calculations. Trusted inspections. Samuel still remembered standing in the rain explaining what he saw. The officer had listened politely before dismissing the concern. Everything checked out on paper. Everything looked fine. For several hours, Samuel had watched that bridge carry trucks, supplies, and equipment without incident. Then came another sound, another tiny complaint from deep inside the structure. The memory remained sharp even after all these years. Samuel had never forgotten the feeling that followed. Not fear, not panic, certainty. He knew exactly what was coming long before anyone else did. The experience changed him forever. After that day, he spent decades studying bridges, support systems, and structural behavior. He learned that failures rarely arrived without warning. The warnings were simply ignored. A gust of wind pulled Samuel back to the present. Fort Ridge returned around him. The canyon, the vehicles, the officers, the bridge. For a brief second, the past and present felt identical. Two different bridges, two different generations. The same mistake. Nearby, Jacob Reed noticed the change in Samuel's expression. The old veteran looked less like an observer now and more like a man reliving an old memory he wished had never happened. The first truck reached the far side of the canyon. Soldiers began relaxing. Some officers smiled. Ryan Brooks looked increasingly satisfied. To him, every passing second proved Samuel wrong. Yet Samuel was no longer watching the trucks. He was watching the support connection beneath the center span. The same location he had identified from the beginning. The same place that continued whispering a warning nobody else seemed able to hear. Then another faint metallic sound drifted through the air. This time Jacob heard it clearly. And this time, so did Samuel. Jacob Reed felt the sound more than he heard it. It traveled through the steel structure like a pulse beneath the skin of something alive. The noise lasted less than a second, yet it seemed to echo inside his head long after it disappeared. Around him, nobody reacted. Technicians continued studying their screens. Officers continued talking. The convoy continued moving according to schedule. Only two people appeared to notice. Jacob and Samuel Carter. The old veteran slowly lifted his eyes from the bridge and looked directly at Jacob. No words passed between them. None were necessary. For the first time that morning, Jacob realized he was no longer questioning whether Samuel believed his own warning. The old man absolutely believed it. The question now was whether he was right. Jacob stepped toward one of the engineering stations. Run another scan on the center support. The technician looked up from his monitor. Why? Just do it. The technician frowned but typed a series of commands. Numbers rolled across the screen. Graphs updated. Several seconds passed. Finally, he shrugged. Everything looks normal. Jacob stared at the display. Green indicators. Stable load readings. No alerts. No warnings. The data looked perfect, yet the uneasy feeling remained. Behind him, Ryan Brooks noticed the exchange and walked over. Still chasing ghosts. Jacob glanced toward the bridge. I want another inspection. Ryan laughed softly. Based on what? Jacob hesitated. A sound. The answer hung awkwardly in the air. Ryan shook his head. You want to halt a military operation because of a sound? Nearby officers exchanged amused looks. One of them smirked. Another quietly chuckled. Jacob felt heat rise in his face, but refused to back down. Something is wrong. Ryan folded his arms. The bridge has already carried two fully loaded trucks. The numbers are solid. The structure is stable. Every engineer here agrees. Samuel's voice drifted across the gravel. Calm. Steady. Not every engineer. The group turned toward him. Ryan exhaled sharply. You keep saying that, but you have not shown us anything. Samuel looked toward the canyon. I already did. Ryan followed his gaze but saw only steel, sunlight, and shadows. Nothing else. The old veteran tapped his cane lightly against the ground. You are watching the bridge. He paused. You should be watching what is holding the bridge. Jacob immediately looked beneath the center span again. This time he noticed something he had missed before. A faint line near one of the support connections. It was tiny, almost invisible from this distance. He narrowed his eyes. Was it a crack? A shadow? A trick of the light? Before he could decide, a gust of wind swept through the canyon and the bridge released another low metallic groan. The sound rolled across the desert air like a warning. Several heads turned this time. Not many. Just enough. For the first time all morning, the confidence around the launch area began to crack. Only slightly. Barely enough to notice. But Samuel Carter noticed. He had been waiting for that moment since the first truck touched the bridge. The next few seconds felt strangely quiet. Not because the engines had stopped. Not because the wind had died. but because uncertainty had finally entered a place where certainty had ruled all morning. Several officers now found themselves looking at the bridge instead of their tablets. The metallic groan still lingered in the back of their minds. It was subtle, easy to dismiss, yet impossible to completely ignore. The first truck had already reached solid ground on the far side of the canyon. The second vehicle continued across the center span. The third waited at the entrance. The convoy remained on schedule. Everything should have felt normal. It did not. Jacob Reed could feel it. He stepped closer to the engineering station again. "Zoom in on the center support connection," he said. The technician hesitated. "Lieutenant Brooks already approved the operation. Just do it." The technician sighed and adjusted the drone feed. The image sharpened on the screen. Steel beams, fasteners, support plates, dust, shadows. Then Jacob saw it. The faint line he had noticed before. This time it was clearer. Not large, not dramatic. Just a thin, irregular mark running along one edge of a connection plate. "What is that?" Jacob asked. The technician leaned forward. "Probably surface wear." "Probably." The technician shrugged. "Could be dirt. Could be paint separation." Jacob stared at the image. Something about it felt wrong. Nearby, Ryan Brooks walked over and glanced at the screen. "There is nothing there." "Look closer." Ryan folded his arms. "You are searching for a problem because an old man told you there was one." Samuel Carter remained silent behind the barrier. His eyes never left the bridge. The desert wind brushed across his face as another faint metallic sound drifted through the canyon. This time several people heard it. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Even Ryan's expression changed slightly. Not fear, not concern, just confusion. The bridge seemed to settle for a moment beneath the weight it carried. Then the sound disappeared. One of the engineers checked his monitor again. Readings still looked normal. Another nodded. No load warnings. The numbers remained green. The computers remained confident. Yet nobody was laughing now. Jacob noticed that immediately. The jokes had stopped. The smirks had vanished. Something invisible had shifted. Samuel slowly tightened his grip on the handle of his cane. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but Jacob saw it, and suddenly he understood. The old veteran was not waiting to see whether he was right. He already knew he was right. He was waiting for everyone else to realize it. Across the canyon, sunlight flashed against the steel framework. The second truck moved another few feet. Somewhere deep inside the structure came a sharp metallic snap. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Every conversation died instantly. The engineer nearest the monitoring station looked down at his screen. For the first time all morning, one of the green indicators flickered yellow. The yellow indicator lasted less than a second before another one appeared beside it. Then a third. The engineer's face drained of color. His fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. "That cannot be right," he whispered. Nearby technicians immediately leaned toward their screens. The relaxed atmosphere that had filled the launch area all morning vanished. Numbers began changing faster than anyone expected. Load distribution that had appeared stable moments earlier now showed irregular fluctuations moving through the center support section. "What is happening?" Ryan Brooks demanded. The engineer swallowed hard. "I do not know." Another technician spoke up. "The readings are not matching the original model." A third looked up from his monitor. "We are seeing stress concentrations where there should not be any." For the first time all morning, nobody looked towards Samuel Carter with amusement. They looked at him because they no longer knew where else to look. The old veteran remained motionless. His expression did not change. Jacob Reed felt his pulse quicken. "Stop the convoy," he said. Ryan did not answer immediately. His confidence had begun to fracture. He stared at the screens, then at the bridge, then back at the screens again. "Stop the convoy," Jacob repeated. This time several engineers nodded. Ryan finally grabbed his radio. His voice sounded different now, less certain, more urgent. Within moments, instructions moved across the operation. Drivers slowed. Movement halted. The bridge stood silent beneath the morning sun. A strange stillness settled over the canyon. The wind continued to blow. Dust drifted across the desert floor. Nobody spoke. Everyone watched. Minutes passed. Inspection teams moved into position. Drone feeds focused on the center support structure. High-resolution images appeared across multiple monitors. Then someone zoomed in. The launch area went silent. The faint line Jacob had noticed earlier was not a shadow. It was not dirt. It was not paint separation. It was a structural fracture hidden beneath a connection plate. Small, difficult to detect, yet perfectly positioned to create a cascading failure if additional load continued crossing the bridge. One engineer removed his glasses and stared at the screen in disbelief. Another slowly sat down without saying a word. Ryan Brooks felt the blood drain from his face. Every report, every inspection, every model, they had all missed it. Samuel Carter had not. Jacob turned toward the old veteran. How did you know? Samuel looked back toward the bridge. It was talking. Several officers exchanged confused glances. Samuel gently tapped his cane against the gravel. Steel always tells you when it is tired. Nobody laughed this time. An hour later, emergency assessment teams completed their analysis. The conclusions spread through the base faster than any official report. The bridge had been far closer to failure than anyone realized. The fracture had begun deep inside a critical connection point beyond the range of routine visual inspection. The convoy had been stopped just in time. Then the lead investigator looked down at the paperwork in front of him. His eyes stopped on a single name. Samuel Carter. The investigator froze. Slowly, he reached for a phone. Because there was something about that name he recognized. Something important. Something that would soon bring an unexpected visitor to Fort Ridge. The phone call lasted less than 2 minutes. That was all it took. The investigator spoke quietly, listened carefully, then ended the call without another word. Around him, engineers continued reviewing reports and images from the bridge inspection. Nobody noticed the change in his expression. Nobody except Jacob Reed. What is it? Jacob asked. The investigator looked up slowly. How long has Samuel Carter been here today? Since before sunrise. The investigator nodded once. Then he looked back at the report. That explains it. Less than 90 minutes later, the distant thump of rotor blades rolled across the desert sky. Every head turned upward. A Black Hawk helicopter appeared beyond the canyon and descended toward Fort Ridge. Dust swirled across the landing zone as the aircraft settled onto the ground. Soldiers stopped what they were doing. Officers stepped aside. Even Ryan Brooks found himself staring. The helicopter door opened. A 3-star general stepped onto the tarmac. Lieutenant General Robert Hayes. One of the most respected engineering commanders in the United States Army. Nobody understood why he was there. Not until he began walking. He did not head toward the command building. He did not head toward the investigation team. He walked directly toward Samuel Carter. The entire launch area fell silent. Samuel stood exactly where he had been standing all morning. His cane rested lightly against the gravel. His faded jacket moved in the wind. The general approached and stopped in front of him. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Then, to the shock of everyone watching, General Hayes came to full attention. The silence became absolute. Ryan Brooks felt his stomach drop. Jacob Reed stared in disbelief. Engineers exchanged stunned looks. The general raised his hand in a formal salute. Sir, he said quietly. Samuel returned a small nod. Nothing more. Yet the respect in that moment carried more weight than any speech. General Hayes lowered his hand and turned toward the gathering crowd. 43 years ago, he said, the United States Army rewrote its bridge failure assessment procedures after a field engineer identified a structural weakness that every inspection team missed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The general continued. That engineer's work became required study throughout the Corps of Engineers. His research has protected soldiers for decades. He paused and looked back at Samuel. That engineer was Samuel Carter. Ryan felt the color drain from his face. Suddenly, every warning, every observation, every quiet statement made sense. Samuel had not guessed. He had not speculated. He had spent a lifetime understanding what others overlooked. General Hayes walked beside the old veteran and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Every engineer on this base benefits from lessons this man taught long before many of us were born. The wind swept across the canyon once more. No one laughed now. No one questioned him. Across the launch area, officers stood quietly while the afternoon sun reflected from the steel bridge that still spanned the canyon. And in that silence, everyone learned the same lesson. Technology could measure a structure. Computers could analyze a structure. But sometimes wisdom came from a man who had spent an entire lifetime listening to what the structure was trying to say.